Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Recently in China, the surge in property prices in first-tier cities has contrasted sharply with great destocking pressure in the smaller cities. The polarization in the Chinese property market might be a microcosm of the whole picture of the Chinese economy. Will the government's differentiated policy towards different cities work? And how can the fever in top cities be cooled while normalizing the rest? To answer those questions, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Mr. Mo Tianquan, board chairman of Sofang.com, and Professor Liu Baochang from the University of International Business and Economics. But before we get started, let's look at this background report.
China's toughest ever home buying restrictions. Shanghai has increased down payment requirements for second apartments to 50% of the buying price, up from 30% last year. Residents from different provinces now have to pay social insurance for 5 consecutive years in order to qualify to buy a home. And down payment loans are now prohibited. Meanwhile, Shenzhen has banned residents from buying more than 2 apartments. And residents from different provinces are only allowed 1 apartment after paying social insurance for 3 consecutive years. And there are more policies on the way to regulate China's housing market.
建立二手房交易资金
We put forward policies cracking down on illegal real estate agents, including the third-party monitoring system for the second-hand house transfer capital and a law enforcement power to regulate real estate companies and agents on their intentional speculation of the house price and false advertisement.
交易等违法违规的行为。
But some people are skeptical of the new regulations.
I think the effectiveness of the regulations will be minor, and I don't think there is any more room for the government to further tighten the market.
Chinese property prices have increased by a lot this year. New home prices soared 57.8% year-on-year in the southern city of Shenzhen. Shanghai registered a 25.1% and Beijing a 14.2% increase from 2015.
Last June, my colleague bought a suite, which has now gone up to 500 million. How many years would you have to work in order to afford this? This applies a lot of psychological pressure. If you didn't buy back then, you might have to work for more than 30 years to be able to afford an apartment.
While first-tier cities are struggling to cool the overheated housing market, lower-tier cities are still facing the challenge of destocking. Data shows that in February, the commercial housing sales ratio of third and fourth-tier cities was 32.07, far more than the reasonable ratio of 15. The new restrictions are expected to curb irrational investment in the property market, but critics say that more may be required to stabilize the market.
Welcome to our studio discussion here. Gentlemen, do you think prices in both Shanghai and Beijing, and perhaps in Shenzhen, have peaked and we have reached the ceiling? There's no longer any margin for any hikes in the housing prices?
Well, I agree, and it's because of recently the policies issued by Shanghai government and Shenzhen government especially, and Beijing. We're waiting for Beijing's policy. Shanghai recently limited, the non-Shanghai citizens to buy until you are paid 5 years tax before you can buy. Shenzhen also tightened the policy to buy properties. So I think with these policies there, the price will stop there for the moment.
Well, I have a very different opinion. 4 years ago, I expected the price peaked. 3 years ago, it peaked. So I waited to buy a second home. And now, I don't believe that there's a peak in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, so in the cities. Because the government is really offering very confusing signals. So we have been trying to bring the price down by introducing a number of measures, but it seems that it doesn't really help. So it's now the workman is crawling with his tools.
What are the driving forces behind the surge?
I think I partially agree with Professor Liu. In the longer run, the price will keep on going in the big cities. But for the time being, say for the rest of the year, I think the big cities, the price probably will stay there for some time. The drivers behind the hiking of the price in the past 12 months I think mainly it's still the demand. Demand side is still very, very strong. The supply side is not enough. So currently in the big cities, we don't have enough supply. It's not like the smaller third and fourth tier cities. That's the I think the main reasons to drive forces behind.
I think that's the fundamental. So supply and demand really creates the price, and this is really beyond the control of the government. And on the other, technically, we also see that the stock market was volatile, and people are now very hesitant to pour the money onto the stock market. So therefore, real estate, the purchase is one option to place some money into the safe haven. So I think, well, actually, there is another reason that, for children's education, because there's no other nation I could see that people care so much about their children's education. And now, because the new policy makes sure that the children can pick school in the area that they have residence, so or they bought their home. So therefore, simply to supply the children with good education, so the districts with good schools really see a surge in the price.
It's true that the first-tier cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou are places where enormous wealth is concentrated. However, what about the future of those who are desperately struggling to make a career success, who want to develop their own career, the young job seekers, the young people whose income is poor and meager income is extremely poor compared with the rich. Therefore, they don't seem to have a future there with a surge in the property market. I mean, with the surge of the housing prices. What do you think of their sense of desperation? Will, however, these young people go back to their own hometowns instead of end up finding a job with a meager income?
I think that's really the challenge to the new generations, for the new graduates, from colleges and the universities. The current situation is that, even with the current policies there, Beijing is coming, and Shanghai and Shenzhen there already. And although the price will stay there for the moment, for the time being, but in the longer run, if the supply is not enough, I think the price will keep on going again. So I think currently the policy, other than kind of depress the demanding, and we need to increase supply. We don't see any policy which are going to to increase the supply yet. So that's one thing about the property market. For the new generations, for the new graduates, I think it is a real challenge. If the price keeps at this level, or keeps them going in the longer run, I think it will be very, very tough for the new graduates to buy a house with their parents or parents' help. But unless they do some entrepreneurship, they start a company and make it very successful, and they will be, they can afford to buy the high-priced properties. Other than that, it's a tough night for them.
I'm not that really sympathetic with the younger generation. You look at Manhattan, how many young people can really buy a house in Manhattan? The backpackers, they flock into the big cities, they find a good career and make money and go to the second-tier cities, and they can really have a stable job and have a family and enjoy life over there. So I think now China is taking the shape. So where in the major cities, you fight for your career, and then you enjoy life in some other places.
What about the revenue, the revenue of those property agencies who may help rent houses to the young students?
I think it just like Professor Liu just mentioned, you really do not need to own a house for a good living. In Manhattan, like New York, and most of the graduates, or in their first 5 years, I would not think that it's easy for them to buy an apartment, a small apartment in Manhattan. So here in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou, those big cities in China, more and more people will live like people living in Manhattan, so which means they are going to rent rather than buy.
Let's look at the efforts by the authorities at different levels to control and regulate the property market. For a long time, many experts from the property industry have complained that the government has abused their powers to intervene, and therefore the more they intervene, the higher the housing prices. What do you think of the twisted form of the relationship between the market and the government? What should be the most reasonable and rational relationship between the market, the invisible forces of the market, and the visible hand of the government?
I think currently for the big cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen, it's really the government is intervening the market, and I think it is necessary sometimes. The market, the free market, may not behave, all the time, and we need government to intervene. But the government, I think, we do need to think in the longer run, which means, very simply demand the supply. So in the big cities, we do need to have a good enough, enough supply there before you can control the price. Without the enough supply there, it's very, very tough. It's impossible to control the price in the longer run. I think that's the fundamental.
And also for quite a few years, governments at different levels have depended on their land sales for the local fiscal revenue. And this golden era is over, it seems to me. And therefore, what are the sources that the government can leverage in regulating the market itself?
Well, we say that a stage in time really saves nine. But the fact in the real estate market, the government really had 9 stages at one time. So therefore, they spin and wheel, reel, almost at the same time. So there is a high level of inconsistency in the policy. Okay, now another is the government role. We discussed the government role with the market, but the other is the central government role versus the local government role. So local government has been highly reliant on the revenue by selling the land. So that's the basic contribution to the price hike. So now, if you really want the local government to have less dependence on the revenue income on the land, so central government will have to really deal with the tax transfer, and will have to be more benevolent. So you can't wait until the local government is getting huge debt burden, and then you exercise benevolence. So there, one way is really to transform the industrial composition of the local government so that it can tax revenue. But I think more immediately is to downsize local government. So we see that too many local governments, they are
well, that's a wild issue. It's a big issue to downsize the local overstaffed government. Now, Mr. Mo, is it true, due to the enormous local debts of the governments, it is absolutely crazy and unthinkable for them to consider even lowering the housing prices, because then they will go bankrupt. And even more government officials would be found guilty of being involved in some of the dirty deals. So they could not afford to let the housing prices fall. The issue of a local debt might be on your radar. What do you think of this concern?
Well, it's a complicated question here, and you have a very, good observation of the things in those third and fourth tier cities. If the market, if it goes very bad, there will be something which become transparent, so which may make trouble and make problems for some of the local, government or local officials. But when I look the China's property market, I always, look at China's market as several markets. So we cannot look at it as one market. In the third and fourth tier market, now it's very tough. You sell land because the demand, it's not there, and there's
already excessive
developer,
overcapacity.
No developer, they're going to pay for the things you're going to sell. So it's not going to happen again. But in the big cities, the provincial capital cities, including the tier 1, Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou cities, and definitely you can still generate a huge amount of money from selling land to developers. So those are the two market situations there.
Okay, thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Mo Tianqian and Professor Liu Baocheng. We're discussing the property market and the impact of latest austerity programs for the first-tier cities such as Shanghai and Shenzhen. We'll be back in a few minutes. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Before we took the break, Mr. Mo briefed us about the tale of two tiers. In fact, that's a phrase used by Financial Times to describe the polarization in the property market. Now, in the Boao Forum for Asia, let me give you a follow-up question, Professor Liu. In the Boao Forum for Asia that was just concluded in Hainan, Mr. Zhou Xiaochuan, head of China's central bank, said there's a little bit too high level for the debt in China. How important is the de-stocking process to the credit-fueled property market?
Well, many of those local governments, they are burdened by the debt, and because of the ill expenditure or because of the ambition really exceeded their capability. Now they seems to have a sort of a saving straw now because during the two sessions, Li Keqiang's the press conference, and he promised to fill the hole of the wallet for the local government if they are not really abusing their power. So this is really something that I cannot really see the logic behind it, because you need really to question the responsibility of those local governors. And on the other, we see that many of the local government, when they have very different situation between coastal area and hinterland area, and so therefore they will have to receive very different treatment from the central government. So in Zhejiang province, in Jiangsu province, local governments are rich enough. They are able to be supported by many of the enterprises, but in some of the Rust Belt areas, in hinterland areas, the local government are really living in a very poor condition.
Last year, what generated the headlines for media around the world was, of course, the almost the collapse of the stock market, which had attracted a lot of the private capital and investment. The bullish stock market was short-lived. Now, this time around, in the year 2016, it seems the trend is opposite. People are considering the property market for their sustainable investment. But do you think their vision for investing in the property market is sustainable for particularly people like me? I mean, I don't want to consider buying new homes. But is it a good channel to put your private money in the property market?
I think for the big market, for the big cities, like the tier 1 cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and other provincial capitals, I still believe in the longer run the price will keep on going up. But I hope steadily, not soaring at one time. So I still think 10 years from today, those big cities are still going to enjoy a good market trend. But for those smaller cities, I will not see the price is going to go up. It's going to stay there for probably for a very long time. So that's a basic judgment from my experience in the industry. So that said, so investment into the big cities property as an investment in a purpose is still worth to do, especially those properties which are not that highly priced at this stage. But I would say it will be disaster if you're going to invest into those smaller cities. So that's the roughly the current judgment from my side.
We've been discussing the robust demand by young university graduates or the growing army of the middle class in urban cities. But what about those people of my age who are going to retire in about 10 years. What are we going to do with what are we going to do with our properties? And is it a good idea to make investment in, for example, residents like nursing homes and places for the retirees and pensioners?
Well, I think in my case, I wouldn't really. Number one, I choose to stay away from stock, however tempting it is, because that can really disturb my whole, the structure of framework. So a mind frame, and for the property, I think, we're better to keep something totally under control instead of betting. There are a lot of migrating homes or even shared homes in the tourist spots. Yes, it may give you something very fresh, but there's a lot of uncertainty involved. Having said that, as advice to investors, now if you really do not have a very strong nerve, you stay away from the stock market, but rather invest into the real estate market. And as Mr. Moore said, so the first tier cities, you cannot really expect any deep dive. So therefore, that's a safe haven.
Now, Mr. Moore, with the end of the golden era for overseas multinationals and with the ongoing decline in our economic growth, I believe in the bustling CBD area like Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, the prices for renting a house, for particularly the companies who would not necessarily buy their office space, what would happen to such kind of prices of the commercial properties?
Well, frankly, commercial property has been, in the price of commercial properties has been also increasing steadily in the past several years, especially in the big cities, tier 1 cities.
You mean there is still strong demand for such properties, although we face the awkward retreat of more and more overseas multinationals from the first-tier cities like Beijing and Shanghai, because they have to relocate their headquarters of R&D as well as their branches of the Asia-Pacific region to low-income economies in our neighboring countries, right?
Well, it was the situation. Multinationals, they occupy the CBD area, office buildings. But now,
despite the hazardous fog in our country, in Beijing,
exactly, now mainly it's the domestic companies, the state-owned companies and the private companies as well. They are really the major buyer or demand, comes from those domestic companies, and like us, so far, we just bought our office building. We spent over 1 billion RMB, to buy office building. We have been looking for office building in the past 5 years, so we actually need offices in many big cities because our operations are in many cities. So I think the demand for offices, as long as it's not oversupply, for most of the tier 1 cities or provincial capitals, will keep on going.
The outrageous prices in the feverish property market in China may have driven a lot of young people and middle-class employees mad, and therefore they turn to other countries for investment in the property market. What do you think of, say, this idea for buying a home in a Mediterranean country, Spain, Portugal, Italy, where you not only have a romantic life, you can increase the value and the worth of your homes if you want to make any serious investment there? And to say nothing of making the same investment in Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other cities of the United States.
Well, if you check on the demographics of those home buyers overseas, they normally are buying the second or third home. So that's more like a migrating home. And they still keep one home within their hometown or within major cities in China. So, and also the primary motivation for most of the buyers overseas, they are not really there to invest, but rather to have a leisure in life, or to support their children to study overseas, or simply to spread the risk. if they think that their money is not really safe enough if they are totally parked in China. So we also can see that over the past 1 decade, many of those buyers overseas, they realize that, okay, now to compare, with the price in Beijing, yes, it is very cheap. But gradually they found they pay a lot of tax, they pay a lot of community expenses, etc. So that may not be as rewarding as they thought when they decide to purchase.
Buying a second or third home overseas is one thing for the middle-class families with a modest income. That is one thing. For Mr. Li Ka-shing, the richest guy in Hong Kong, the business property tycoon, to beat retreat from the mainland market is quite another. How do you read into the retreat of Li Ka-shing from the mainland?
I think we have been seeing recently more and more Chinese people, they are buying properties overseas for multiple reasons, like Professor Liu just described. For those, they are not exiting, those Chinese people, they're not exiting China, they're just adding some properties in other countries. But for tycoons, business tycoons like Li Ka-shing, they are selling Chinese properties and then they are investing in other countries. That's a different.
In the UK, for example.
Yeah, that's a different thing. I think it's a business decision first, and the fundamentals still support their decisions. China's general economy is slowing down. That's a fact, and we don't know how long it's going to take for China's economy to be stable. So to get a reasonable or good return. For the allocation of their investment and assets around the globe, and I think they have their business decision to sell in China and buy in other countries. So this it does cause some reasoning for us for us staying in China, for China's policymakers. So we do need to. I think general economy is the key thing.
Right. Very quickly, Professor Liu, what's your therapy for the third and the fourth tier cities where we do have the severity of overcapacity? Destalking, what does that mean? Some go as far as to suggest that those empty cities could be used for nursing homes, for hospitals for the retirees. That could be a very good idea, full of innovative spirit.
I think it's it's more appropriate to put people in exile, instead of. Would you like to go to a ghost? Would you like to go to a ghost city, even if it's it is very cheap? You need the right type of amenity, facility, the neighborhood to live a life. So therefore, look at the Yingkou, the oversupply, Shenyang oversupply. So therefore, either you demolish, Xi'an is beginning to demolish, and the other is really to revive your economy and to create more jobs and give more
Thank
better
you very
life
much.
opportunities.
Thank you for pouring scorns on this idea. I can understand very well your concerns. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on China's property market. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.